Well, first off, Rupert and Normals, thank you all so much for having me. It's a thrill to be able to share not only my work, but I'm especially thrilled because these are the types of books that one normally doesn't get invited to read from. Because Looking for Lost Streets is essentially a bibliography. And
don't read from that one.
Don't worry, I'm not going to just read bibliographic citations for 15 minutes. And Fliers, Middleweights, and Lowlifes is sort of a critical reference volume. But they're really, mystery books in their own right, because if anyone knows Goodis, he's a mysterious figure in, he passed away in the late 60s, and we're still finding new things about his life and his work. And these are really trying to fill in a gap about his early years writing for Pulp magazines. When he passed away, there was no bibliography in the years since. His estate has not issued one. About 15-ish years ago, there was a collection of his short stories where someone tried to grapple with the fact that he was writing under a lot of pseudonyms. However, they were also shared by other pulp writers, so no one ever knew for sure exactly what David Goodis wrote. If you haven't read him before, his style is, summarized by the titles of his books. Retreat from Oblivion, Down There, Street of the Lost, Street of No Return, Somebody's Done For. Very, very uplifting, cheerful, not at all. They're very melancholic. They're not hard-boiled. He doesn't write about private detectives. When he does do a cop book like Night Squad, it's not Ed McBain. He's not really interested in procedurals at all. Very often sort of depressed alcoholic characters that had a glimpse of success at one point and then fell. And now he is coming back into popularity. Most of his books are in print. Highly recommend all of them. But it's the short stories that have been the biggest mystery. And a couple years ago, I was at the New York Public Library researching Dave Keene, who's another pulp and paperback writer, and I came across a sales record in the Popular Publications Inc. archive, and it was for a short story called Busybody, under the pseudonym Ray P. Shotwell. And that had been attributed to Goodis. And so that was the first evidence that there actually might be sales records for Goodis that exist but haven't been consulted yet. So I went back and thankfully I found them. So that became Looking for Lost Streets. I'm briefly going to read from the introduction. When David Goodis titled his debut novel Retreat from Oblivion in 1939, little did the future noir legend realize he was writing a grimly fitting epithet for his own career and literary legacy. At the time of his death in 1967, at age 49, all of his works were out of print in the United States, and his final novel was still several months away from publication. Its title, Somebody's Done For, suggested a death sentence more than a last hurrah. Over the past several decades, however, Goodis, like a noir phoenix, has risen from the ashes to become one of the preeminent writers of mid-century American crime fiction. But while many of his novels have been reissued, his early pulp stories remain underappreciated and out of print. The combined lack of access and absence of a definitive bibliography has resulted in a severe dearth of scholarship and criticism on this aspect of his career. In the nearly 80 years since he first appeared in the Pulps, the only dedicated volume is Black Friday and Other Stories from 2006, edited by Adrian Wooten, which included 5 stories under his name and 6 under pseudonyms. Furthermore, any attempt at a complete bibliography is complicated by the fact that his work often appeared under shared house names, making authorship difficult to establish. Wooten wasn't kidding when he described Goodis's bibliography as, quote, a considerable headache, because there is little or no documentation such as royalty statements or contracts to help identify and source the material, end quote. Such is the damnation of the Goodis fan, to be eternally tempted by what he could have written. And so, as I said, many of the answers to these questions I found at the New York Public Library. Been able to find even more pseudonyms. In all, I was able to add 56 confirmed stories, to what was already under Goodis' own name. And these are under the house names Logan C. Claiborne, David Crew, Byron C. Ford, Lance Kermit, Arthur L. Kramer, Roy C. Rainey, H.P. Rainey, and Ray P. Shotwell. Crew, Kermit, Claiborne, and Shotwell have long been known as aliases, thanks to Philippe Garnier's Goodis, A Life in Black and White. But those other names hadn't been established before. So now there's a total of 179 Goodis stories known. But while I was also in the archives, I found 95 other writers who were using those same names that had never been identified before. And that's what a large part of this is, which is about, restoring their, the legacy to their bibliographies. And some of them were big names, like H.A. DeRosso, Day Keene, William Cox, a lot of big writers at the time. The biggest thing about this discovery, though, is that now we can actually see that Goodis's short fiction was concentrated between 39 and 46. In 39 was his debut novel, Retreat from Oblivion, which was essentially a modernist melodrama about a copywriter in New York, which Goodis was for a while. And just these interconnected couples who were all cheating on each other's spouses with each other. And then in 46 is Dark Passage, which is a fully fledged crime novel about a man wrongly accused of murdering his wife. He gets sent to prison, he escapes, and has to undergo plastic surgery so he can change his face and prove himself innocent. You can probably imagine that, since this is Goodis, it does not go well. It was turned into a movie with Bogart and Bacall in 47, and was the first of many adaptations of his work. The big mystery is, how does he get from this essentially soapy melodrama to this, what we would call today noir? And so that's the mystery that this book is trying to answer. I'm going to read briefly from the introduction. From his second novel onward, Goodis wrote mostly crime novels. Therefore, one might assume that he would have excelled at writing short stories in the same genre. Reading the stories, however, reveals that Goodis was not a natural crime storyteller at all. And I should add, for this book, I was able to track down 176 of the 179 stories. The last three I have not given up on. Most of them have never been reprinted, so it's a matter of tracking down the actual issues, most of which aren't even in the Library of Congress. For the most part, Goodis's earliest work for the mystery pulps are among his weakest stories. The plots are juvenile, the characters stock and cardboard thin, and the language hackneyed to the point that one must question whether it's intended as parody. One of the outstanding exceptions is his debut, The Devil Keeps a Woman, from 10-Story Gang, August 1939. It's a violent story about a Harlem gangland rivalry and the three gangsters who fight over a gun mall named Nita. And that love triangle is essentially, that's the core of Retreat from Oblivion. Goodis was just rewriting his literary novel for the Pulps and threw in some gangsters and guns. And his second short story is just that same story with different gangsters. He quickly learned how to sell to the Pulps, just rewrite the same thing over and over again. Relentlessly bitter and nasty, The Devil Keeps a Woman is a hell of a start to a career in the Pulps, punctuated with bullets, thoroughly soaked in blood. While it still caters to caricature, it punches harder than many of the stories that would follow. Perhaps because he was starting out, he went straight no chaser for sensationalism. The prose is crude and focused more on brutality than character psychology or poetic description, but there's a dark energy to it that's lacking in his other early crime stories. The ending is unmistakably Goodis. It is full of hopelessness and nihilism. After a bloody shootout, Danny, the gangster, is cornered by his rival's gunman. So of course he grabs Nita's corpse and jumps out the window to his own death. Suicide reverberates throughout Goodis's work, all the way to his final story, The Plunge, in 1958, which similarly ends with a leap to one's own demise. When one thinks of Goodis, one thinks of every person protagonists, like the bus driver in Cassidy's Girl, Eddie the ruined concert pianist reduced to honky-tonks down there, or James Bevan in The Wounded and the Slain, a husband who goes to Jamaica to patch up his marriage and accidentally kills a man in the bar one night. It's the hallmark of Goodis's crime novels is his humanized protagonists, not hard-boiled human, but living, breathing, hurting, and all too human souls who always make the wrong decision, and even when they try to make the right one, fate gets in the way. The people of his crime pulp stories, on the other hand, are straight from central casting. Gangsters written by somebody who's only watched Cagney and George Raft movies. He's so inept at writing private eyes that his most compelling depiction of one is a farce in which the detective blunders every possible opportunity. It's called A Knife in Your Back. It is worth tracking down. I think he finally realized, I'm not good at writing whodunits. I can't write hard-boiled. So really the question is, what was Goodis good at writing at this point? His second best crime story was called A Smile and a Nod from September '42. It's about a drifter who hitchhikes intending to rob and murder the driver, but he doesn't expect the car to be driven by a fugitive on the run from the cops. Instead of cartoonishly abhorrent gangsters and dopey private eyes, here we get a sympathetic, relatable character. An orphaned boy raised in a reformatory, saddled with family debt, rootless, tossed aside by society, and who turns to crime because he has no one else to turn to, and because living a virtuous life hasn't done anything for him so far. The world was cruel to him, so why shouldn't he in turn be cruel? Despite this being the most noir among his crime stories to date, it would be his last straight crime narrative until Dark Passage in July '46, nearly 4 years later. What happened during that time? Aviation. And that's really what I wanted to explore in this book, which is the aviation stories are typically made fun of because they have ridiculous titles. But he wrote, I think, 140 aviation stories, over the course of like 5 years, 5 or 6 years. And it is often the same plot over and over again, but one gets the sense that he's actually, trying to work something out. And by reading all 140 of them, you can actually see what's going on. Goodis romanticized the potential of the skies. There's no problem that can't be solved by taking to the air. Whether you want to run away from your past, settle family feuds, atone for your sins, get back your girl, relive collegiate sports glory, prove you aren't a traitor, or just make the world a better place by taking down some Nazis, anything is possible with an airplane. And there's a general formula to his aviation stories that goes back to his earliest tale, Bullets for the Brave, from Battlebirds, February 1940. A pilot has personal drama, and in this case, he's accused of cowardice. He's shot down but survives the crash. Often he's taken prisoner. He always punches his way to freedom and manages to get back to base, which frequently actually causes more problems. In this case, that from which he ran away from is waiting for him. Here, he's arrested for treason because he was found wearing a German uniform. The only solution is to escape custody once again, steal another plane, head back into enemy territory to defeat the enemy single-handedly. Often they are chased by their own compatriots who quickly realize that the main character was telling the truth all along. Or, in the case of this story, they are shot down into enemy territory again and awaken in a hospital bed to find out they have been exonerated and the enemy obliterated. It makes for a very fast solution. And Goodis reworked this plot over and over again. But the more he started to rework it, that's where you see his artistry and what we would call noir come about. Goodis's aviators are frequently outsiders, loners running from their past, unable to confide in their fellow pilots for fear of the truth coming out, and they take solace in alcohol and suicidal behavior. Seen in this light, the aviation stories are ground zero for Goodis's noir. It's where the darkness all begins. Amidst all the daring deeds and aerial theatrics, Goodis's characteristic melancholy voice frequently cuts through, giving psychological depth to the characters and an ominous sense of mortality and dread to the atmosphere. I just want to read, it's a quote from Sky Meat for Nazis from September 1940 by Ulysses. These titles were mostly, sometimes the writers came up with them, often they would be decided by the editors. So despite that ridiculous title, you get passages like this. At night he went out and walked the darkened streets and heard the whining of a motor and the sound of Fred's voice. He sat in the outdoor cafes and tried to drink the heaviness out of his brain, but he succeeded only in making himself very sick. He went back to his room and tried to sleep, but finally it was nothing more than a matter of standing by the window and looking out and wondering when it would end. It had to end. It had to leave his mind. If it kept up much longer, he would do something desperate. For instance, the Seine was nice and deep. And if you've read Goodis's work, this idea of drowning, it goes all the way to his last novel, Somebody's Done For, begins with a character in the ocean just trying to will himself to sink to the bottom. And it's moments like that when you start to realize that the aviation stories, despite the fact there are 140 of them, that's where he starts developing his artistry. This is the stuff that's not in the crime stories. Do I have a minute left? So, so I actually wanted to end with one of the real surprises of this research, which is the aviation magazines had letter columns where the fans could write in, and there's not a lot of scholarship at the time on Pulp magazines. They weren't reviewed in newspapers, so seeing fan reactions is really like that's how we can see firsthand how people were interpreting these stories at the time. And what I discovered is it's not so different than fan culture today. The fans would write in and would troll the magazines. They would often wish death and dismemberment upon the editors and sometimes the writers themselves. And the magazines loved it because they would actually offer prints of the Blakesley, who would do all the fantastic aerial paintings on the covers. If you found 3 errors, you would get a print. Supposedly, because people would write in demanding, where is my print? You printed my letter last month. These people would write over and over again. But what's really amazing is seeing the cross-section of people writing. Some of them are teenagers. Some of them are people that were actually in the military. One of them, the quote is, "David Goodis is my favorite writer, though I hardly know why." And it's Talmadge Powell, Hutchinson, Kansas. Talmadge Powell was later a paperback writer. This has a D in his name, he didn't. I don't know if that was just a spelling error, but I just love the fact that a potential future pulp writer is in his military base reading these stories. This is one story by a letter from a guy named Mac Audsley from College Park, Georgia, who wrote multiple times. Dear Droopy Drawers, well, I have a complaint to make. David Goodis and the others write some good story, but it's always the same old thing about some hellbound Yank who quit a good airline job in the US to join the RAF. He's tough, or at least he thinks he is. The second he sets foot on the airfield, he doesn't like the Fliers there, so he bashes the CO's face in, runs out on the field, jumps in a Spitfire, and takes off, heading to Germany. On the way over, he shoots down half of the German Air Force and flies on. Finally, he gets engine trouble and has to land. The German army rushes at him, and he proceeds to wipe it out. But at last, he gets busted on the head and is taken off to Nazi high command and is set in front of a general for questioning, breaks loose, grabs a Luger, shoots the guards, conks the big shot, slings him over his shoulder, grabs a handful of important papers, runs out of the building, jumps in a mess up, takes off with the general sitting in his lap. And on the way back to England, he cleans out the rest of the German Air Force. So he lands on his field, turns over the general and the papers to the CO, and all is forgiven. Booey. Yeah, I know that they're just stories, but they're too fantastic, don't you think? The thing is, that is literally so many of Goodis' stories. Other letters, they're talking about the caliber of bullets, where the parachutes are. People were, really paying, attention to all the details in the stories. And I don't know enough about aviation to tell you whether Goodis knew what he was talking about or not. He did take courses at Temple University in military strategy. So essentially that's what these books are. It's, my intention is that people who, might know Goodis from some of the novels, this might help paint a bigger portrait of him. And if you are a collector, this might help you figure out which of those 140 aviation issues you might want to track down. Thank you very much for the opportunity.